My name is Jason Begley. I'm an associate professor at Coventry University. I'm an Irish academic working in the UK, so it's not your English, it is my accent. The project I was leading on, it was a consortium of partners and stakeholders from 4 different regions. And we were looking at urban-rural connectivity in non-metropolitan regions. The acronym is 100% my fault as well. I apologize. The partners, the research partners involved were Coventry University in the UK. We were working on behalf of Scarborough, who were the lead stakeholders. There was the University of Valencia. We had Politico di Torino in Italy, and we also had Nordregio in Sweden. And just so you can just see that sort of first picture there is actually from Scarborough itself. So I just want to talk about the project in a little bit. The project has just finished. We have the main report and scientific annexes are available online at this point in time. And so the aims and objectives were to improve connectivity and accessibility in non-metropolitan regions. And as you've alluded to, as the moderator has alluded to, it's not an easy thing to define simply because the deeper you go, the more complex and more difficult it is to disaggregate what is a functional region, what is a non-metropolitan region. And the example I give is in Marina Alta in Spain. When you look at it from a NUTS classification, and if you look at it from a European documentation level, it's classified as a metropolitan region because it's considered attached to Alicante or to Valencia. But when you actually go to the national perspective on it, it's considered a non-metropolitan region because its urban centre is actually Denia, which is a small port town. And this is a recurring issue in terms of the functionality of the regions in question, how you consider a functional region. And our approach was to look at the urban-rural linkages, the flows of movement of work, flows and movement of peoples across the territory to take advantages of employment opportunities, to take advantage of services, to take advantage of leisure activities. And a major issue that we saw that intersected with all of this was tourist activity, for example, peoples outside the region moving into the region, further confusing the situation of flows and movements of peoples. The 4 territories, just to reiterate, were Scarborough Borough in the UK, and I just have a map here. Is there a little, you can just, sorry, is there a pointer on this? If I press this, will it break? Is it this one? Okay, let's forget the pointer. You all know where the UK is. We've just outlined in red where Scarborough is. Then there's Västerbotten in Sweden, which, amusing to me, had a population slightly smaller than the county of Leitrim in Ireland, but a territory almost equivalent to the size of Ireland itself. There was also, you might not be able to see it that well, it was Valorossia, which was in the province of Liguria, in the province of Imperia in region Liguria in Italy, and then it's Marina Alta down in Alicante in Spain. And all 4 territories had common issues, which is why I think they approached ESPON and asked them to sort of engage in research activity around this. They're coastal in nature, and all the population is concentrated along the coast, and you have large-ish towns, 100,000, 150,000, below. So the typical way to look at a metropolitan, non-metropolitan region is through population dispersal. But all 4 territories had concentrations along the coast, and then it had pockets of population dotted in the interior. And what you saw then when you looked at commuting patterns in particular was a fan effect during the day where people would move into these coastal regions to take advantage of employment in particular. And then that evening there would be an outflow back in the opposite direction into these, disconnected pockets of population. And so you have these long coastlines, poorly connected then to the interior, and that was a major issue, again, in improving accessibility and improving transport connectivity. The major issue that was brought to our attention was that of being prioritised by regional governments and national governments. What the municipalities, and in the case of the UK, the Borough Council, felt was that they really needed a voice, a seat at the table to be taken seriously in terms of improving transport and accessibility. What tended to happen was they were low down the list of priorities, and when an area was developed, they were last, and when funding was cut, they were first. And to give you an example, one of our stakeholders in Italy gave the following quote, almost off the cuff. To date, at regional level, there is not a transport plan. We're working on it with external consultants that are helping us. And that was a recurring theme where there was the lack of capacity to deliver planning, and there was a lack of understanding of what the challenges were for these non-metropolitan regions. However, when we looked at it from a top-down perspective, there were commonalities, but each of the regions were distinctly different. So we decided what was required was a series of case study activities. Thereafter, we would make recommendations from discussing the situation with the stakeholders and from the European literature itself. And we would then create a series of policy tools to help, first of all, strategize and then deliver a series of planning recommendations. So the case study areas, we considered them from a number of different perspectives. First of all, we contextualized them, giving an overview of the area territorially and demographically. Then we looked at the economic structure. Then we looked at the institutional framework and the policy environment in which transport and accessibility policy was delivered. We also engaged in the activity of it, trying to identify urban-rural linkages, trying to understand the nature of the region itself and the nature of what we consider a functional region for these non-metropolitan areas. And then we looked at the transport provision and accessibility challenges within the regions themselves, within the territories themselves. And so we were informed by this top-down approach and then this bottom-up approach. And this then was used to create these tools, which I'll talk about in a moment. And thereafter, we look for commonalities across these territories to help inform guidelines and recommendations for European policymakers. So just to give you an example of some of the activities we engaged with, this was Nordregio actually went through the literature, undertook to a better understanding of urban-rural linkages. We then brought this to our stakeholders and asked them to identify in terms of relevance what they considered the most important components to their linkages in their territories. And as you can see, for example, if you look at demographic linkages, urban-rural migration was considered highly relevant in all 4 territories, so we used that as an informant for recommendations back to the European Union and to policymakers, but at the same time, each of the territories had other highly relevant areas. So if you go to Marina Alt and Scarborough, for example, consumer relationships, central place, and developing services, etc., these were all considered highly relevant as well. And if you look at the example of Västerbotten, this enormous territory, long-distance commuting was considered highly relevant. So we also had to tailor recommendations specifically to each of the territories. So again, sorry, this is actually, the little picture there is Valarussia, which is this very small valley area within the broader province and region. So here are the policy recommendations and the tools we developed as a consequence. So how did we approach it? We first of all captured policy recommendations under 2 broad categories, both specific and general. These were then further subdivided into market, consumers, perceptions, stakeholders, policy and government, economic, socio-cultural and technological features. We also then made operational recommendations, particularly in relation to demand-responsive transport. So we looked at a range of demand-responsive transport solutions and recommended how they might be implemented in each one of these territories. The second area that was then considered under operational recommendations was non-material and transversal actions, which I'll explain in a moment. And then the final area was structural interventions and then intermodality. Then we took these tools, made specific recommendations, extracted what we saw were the major recommendations that we can take back and recommend to other non-metropolitan regions of similar characteristics. And what we suggest is that they can adopt these tools and this approach to make their own delivery plans. So it's of specific interest, I think, to coastal territories. And then eventually we then made recommendations as well, a second set of recommendations for the EU policy making. And finally, we also made some very minor recommendations about the issue of Brexit, which, well, we'll leave that one there. So this basically is the ID card. And this is sort of just how we, this is the sort of the template for it. And this then is the Scarborough version of that same, so that's the ID card, and that's the Scarborough version thereof, which I understand better because I was working on that particular case study. And so if you look down the left, you'll see target territory, suburbs, and rural accessible. So this is very specific to Scarborough itself. When you look down the centre, then the specific challenges around market demand, work, school, and for example, one of the issues that they have in Scarborough is once you turn 16, you're no longer applicable to use school transport. So all the sixth formers, the final years, suddenly had to get lifts to work to schooling, which was very strange. And then you have on the right, you have general challenges around policy and government, economic and so forth. We then took these challenges and we took from the literature a series of policy recommendations, and we then filled them into this delivery plan. So if you look across the top, it's priority, complexity, time frame, provider, actions and outcomes, and then on a 1 to 4 rating. And then you have the solutions down the left-hand side under operational, specific and general, and this was the brainchild of our Italian partners from Politecnico di Torino, so my thanks to Giancarlo and his team there. And this is what that delivery plan then looks like. So again, I'm using it for Scarborough because I know Scarborough best. And if you look across the top, do you want to implement a village minibus in Scarborough? And it's a reasonably high priority. It's reasonably complex to do so because of regulations around who can drive these buses and who can use these buses. And it's actually reasonably difficult to deliver, for example. And if you go down somewhat further, if you look at structural improvements, which was a major issue for the stakeholders, we can see this is an incredibly high priority. It's less complex, the major complexity being getting funding, and then it's more complex to deliver because it intersects with a range of different delivery units. So the policy-making landscape was quite, how should we say, there's quite a lot of redundancies built into it, I think is the kindest way to put it. There were a number of different organizations intersecting with delivery, and one was in charge of parking off-road, and one was in charge of parking on-road, just as an example. So it was quite a confused, almost chaotic landscape. So having taken these bottom-up approaches and looked at the delivery required for each of the territories, we then tried to determine what was relevant to other non-metropolitan regions and what was relevant to policymakers considering making changes to their, their approaches. And this final picture is there. That is actually Västerbotten, quite a lovely little picture. So again, we approached it under the same sort of styling, recommendations for both specific and general context. So in the specific context, just as an example, we quickly realized that there was a requirement to strengthen public transport-friendly culture. But again, in these particular territories, it wasn't just about persuading people to switch from car, for example, to public transport. It was also about making it available in unusual hours and at unusual times. One of the issues brought to us, again, by Scarborough, which I know best, was about night links, about people getting lifts back from major towns to the territory after hours. In the case of Västerbotten, there was one bus journey at the end of the day, and if you missed it, you were overnighting in the main city. So that was, again, another major challenge. Promoting the mixed use of transport services, and I think this is an interesting outcome as well. It's not just about segregating traffic, but it's also about mixing the usage of people who take advantage of transport itself. So for example, one of the recommendations we made to Scarborough and we made to Västerbotten, Region Västerbotten, which was the provincial stakeholder involved for Sweden, one of the recommendations we made around bus journeys was to allow elderly people to also travel on school transport. Because again, what was happening was the bus was zipping by a house, picking up a child and then driving on to the next house, and there's some little old dear in her house next door going, why can't I get on this bus? I mean, it's going free and I could do with this travel journey. One of the issues was in terms of replying to funding or engaging in policy-making decisions wasn't about skills or upskilling, it was about capacity and capacity issues. So when we make a recommendations then about funding, our recommendation isn't just about simplifying it, but it's also about understanding the capacity build that's required for these smaller territories to take advantage of broader, more diverse funding packages. In the general context, again, governance was a major issue, and there was a sense that they were not getting the required representation even at regional level, or weren't being taken seriously at all at national level. And one of the suggestions we made was perhaps about putting in place permanent working groups with very fixed goals and objectives and certain pots of funding made available, solely to non-metropolitan regions. And I think it's that siphoning and siloing of funding is an essential component to helping develop and deliver from a local level or municipal or borough level the required input from local stakeholders. And again, this builds into the second point here, which is around cross-municipality opportunities and about having greater flexibility around rules and regulations. And what we perceived in particular is that the classical administrative boundaries, which were built in from many decades, many centuries, around regions and around territories, don't actually reflect the current economic and social landscape of travel, movement, advantages of services and employment opportunities. And perhaps that should be more flexible in its thinking. There was also recommendations around combating urban development and combating urban sprawl. One of the problems was as soon as the territories began to sprawl, then the services became incrementally more expensive, which again, many understand. However, at the same time, one of the issues as well is about reversing marginalization. So while it's encouraging to bring people back into urban towns and urban centres, if it's at the expense of those who are left behind, then this process needs to be rethought. In particular, one of the major issues, and I'll touch on this again tomorrow, one of the major issues for the policyholders was maintaining existing economic opportunities and economic leaders within their territories. So a lot of the emphasis was on attracting new employment and new opportunities, and yet the response was actually we're more worried about McCain Chips leaving and going somewhere else than we are about attracting in the newest sort of computer digital firm. And finally, the other point was around bridging the digital divide. A lot of the emphasis was on promoting e-services and telemedicine and all these other services, which are hugely beneficial. However, it seemed to be at the cost of delivering other forms of physical human contact or other forms of engagement. And essentially what we were seeing was it was siloing and isolating, particularly elderly peoples, where you introduce a telemedicine service and says, great, now we don't have to drive an ambulance out there anymore, and that person might not get to see anybody for the next 6 months or something like that. So again, it's a double-edged sword, and we need to think carefully about how we introduce e-mobile services and so forth. It shouldn't come as a cheaper option at the expense of the peoples involved. So then we made, this is the last slide, recommendations then based on our project back to the EU to help them redefine their policy-making approaches. So one of the first ones is around rural-urban and rural-rural connections in non-metropolitan regions should be considered as an element that strengthens territorial cohesion. Too often the approach was to consider these areas in terms of market forces. How can we afford this? How can we introduce a service if it's only meeting it's only meeting the needs of 2 people and it's costing us X amount of cash, and everything seemed to be led through a market response. And our argument was that actually you need to think about the integrity, the unique character that this area has, how attractive it is to other outside peoples to visit, and if you begin to lose that, if it begins to degenerate, then that also is a cost. In particular, the issue of tourism kept reoccurring, and tourism is, again, something of a double-edged sword because tourism is a major seasonal driver of employment and economic development, but it's not treated seriously at national level in particular. It's almost seen as a second-class economic activity, and so what was happening was you had the territory being funded for its population and only its population, and then during the summer months the transport system was overloaded with millions of visitors in the case of one of the partners coming to see a national park, for example, and trying to operate on a system that was only built for 100,000 people. And so one of the takeaways that we were asked to very much stress was seeing tourism as a high-quality economic activity. In the case of Marina Alta, marine tourism was very high profile and engaged quite a lot of wealth-creating activities, but also to better understand what it means in terms of structure and infrastructure. A representative model of urban-rural linkages should also be investigated to better understand the function and nature of regions. I've already mentioned the case of Marina Alta, where again there's different perspectives on what it is in terms of a region and where its actual centre of activity is located. And what we would stress is that, in fact, travel patterns are very important to try and understand. where the center of a region's activities are actually based and who is connected to it. I've already mentioned the digitization services, so I'll skip on to the next one. Improve governance and collaboration, which we think is very, very important. Again, European, national and regional institutions should include mechanisms that bind funding of transport and connectivity projects in rural areas. In particular, as I say, when it comes to funding, last on the list of priorities, first on the list of being cut. And if we can separate the funding and make sure that it is less, so we say, treated with more confidence in terms of who can access it and how it can be used over a longer and more consistent and stable period of time, I think that would then encourage investment by other business activities in these regions. Finally, we did make recommendations around Brexit, in particular around financial solutions, but when we started the project, we had expected Brexit to be complete, and that didn't go quite as anybody planned, and so we couldn't really make as clear-cut recommendations as a consequence of that. We're sort of left in limbo. And I'll just leave it at that. Thank you very much for your time.